Well, how many of you knew exactly what you wanted to be when you grew up, when you were a little kid? Some people, the answer is doctor or lawyer, firefighter, artist, zookeeper. I knew exactly what I wanted to be from the time I was 6 or 7. I wanted to be a grown-up. And it was that clear. I didn't care what kind of grown-up. I wanted to be a grown-up as fast as possible. I remember that distinct feeling of wanting to skip decades and just be in a different set of skin. As a 7 or 8-year-old, I owned albums by Abbott and Costello. I had a cappuccino machine. I owned the entire silent film collection of Charlie Chaplin by my 10th birthday and listened to the Benny Goodman Orchestra. My version of what it meant to grow up has not come to pass. Because apparently 7 or 8-year-old Aaron thought that being a grown-up looked a heck of a lot like being a 1930s vaudeville performer. My walls covered with pictures of Harry Houdini and Abbott and Costello and Bela Lugosi. And so, my understanding of what it meant to mature and what it has meant to mature has not been a perfect match. What I thought being a grown-up looked like then and the requirements of meaning-making on me now as a dad and a husband, as a minister or a citizen or friend, boy, those two things are just from different worlds. There are many days when I look in the mirror and think, how did they give that person responsibility for human lives? They just sent that guy home with babies? Wow. That doesn't look like a grown-up to me. Anybody else feel like you're not quite a grown-up? Yeah. There's some tentative hands in the back. There's a woman named Jennifer Garvey Berger who writes about what it means for adults to keep growing up, which is a terrifying proposition for some of us who wish it was over, and a really freeing idea for those of us who are glad there might still be time. She studies adult human development, the stages of what our mindsets and sense-making toolbox looks like as we grow well into all our years, and age and wisdom aren't necessarily the same in these systems. She talks about the fact that for those of us living in the postmodern world, which is you and me, we don't have the same kind of clear, precise map of what it meant to make sense of the world that our ancestors did. And this is for better and for worse. A lot of those sense-making maps were oppressive and limiting, particularly to some people. However, for better or for worse, what she says is without those solid sense-making maps, and by that I mean you know what you're going to be when you grow up, because that's what your parents did. And you know who you're going to marry, because there's 4 other people who live in your town. And you know what God is, because the tribe or the place where you worship tells you what God is. And you know what it means to be a partner or parent. And if not, you don't ask. And then when you get sick, there's a way to make sense of it. And when someone you love dies, there's a way to make sense of it. And when you die, there's a map, better or worse. And for those of us living in this era, the map has been kind of thrown in the shredder. The typical places we used to look for wisdom, like churches or political parties or traditional family structures, are being questioned for the good. But what it means is there's not one place that all of us can depend on for solid knowledge, especially in an era when we're questioning whether what we hear on the news or from a politician or from a preacher is even true. And so she talks about what does it mean to grow up now without a map. She defines learning and growing differently, and she says there's a huge difference between the two. Learning is getting more information and putting it into a container. and growing is changing the container. People who are in, let's say, Western, typically highly educated, progressive, intellectual type environments tend to associate learning and growth, tend to believe they're the same thing sometimes, and they're not. Learning is putting a lot of rocks into a bucket, and then next time putting different rocks or more rocks into the bucket, and growth is no longer being a bucket. She says they're very different things. And she makes the claim that growth, that kind of transformation, changing the container and the very sense-making system you have, very rarely happens unless we are forced to do it. When everything's going well and your paycheck comes in on time, food's on the table, your partner is happy, when you get done speaking, they clap their hands and there's a gold star on the report card, you don't have much of a reason adaptively to change the way that you make sense of the world. In fact, if you do and you start growing too fast, the people in your family or your church are going to say, "What's wrong with you?" She says that we tend to grow, to break open the container and become a new one when the person we are and the world that we're in no longer match if we want to make sense of life. Does that make sense and resonate? Okay, because I'm still working on that idea. As I understand it, it's kind of like the difference between being a bicycle and being a boat. So if I'm a bike and one road is clogged, I just go through a different path. But then if it floods, it's no longer good to be a bike. I can't just pick a different road, I have to become a boat. And that's what I would like to talk about today. What does it mean for us to grow as adults? Spiritually, emotionally, and maybe as a country. As a country, it feels to me like we are not in a learning moment. That we're in a time which calls for some very radical growth. Getting a new set of skin. Getting a new container. Becoming a boat that can help with the maybe literal rising waters. Like a lot of you, I'm assuming, I was sitting in front of my television on Tuesday night, glued to every last vote that was coming in counties I had never heard of before, asking myself, what direction are we going in as a country? And then at the end of the election, I don't know. I got back some ambiguous answers, and the map doesn't make sense to me. We had the opportunity, Beth and I and a group of about 25 members of our church 2 weeks ago, to go to Boston together and reflect on the history of this church and our ancestors and how it affects what we do today. It was so interesting for us to sit in the public garden in Boston or at Walden Pond talking about whether or not this was the most divided and polarized time in our country. And we did so, we realized one day while we were sitting under a statue of a U.S. senator who had been beaten almost to death with a cane and left for dead on the floor of the U.S. Senate in the 1840s for his stance on abolition. We sat and we heard stories of people arguing about abolition, arguing about whether humans are allowed to be bought and sold. When women couldn't go to school or vote or own property. And we found ourselves coming to the conclusion that it is bad, but maybe not the most polarized it had ever been. We talked about what it means to be a patriot in those moments and how you deal with a country in which you can't make sense anymore. Ralph Waldo Emerson's wife and Henry David Thoreau's mother in Concord, Massachusetts in the 1840s, when they would have 4th of July parades, instead of red, white, and blue flags, they would drape their windows in black cloth and said, "We cannot celebrate until this country is worthy of celebration." People haven't been kneeling during the anthem just in the last few months. The question is, how do we make sense as a people? Because I'm sure, like me, You're struggling where you look back and you go, all the same tools we used to use, the political parties and the religions, the family dynamics that we used to use when things got hard, they don't seem like they're working. Just putting new information into the bucket doesn't seem like it's going to solve this problem. We have to be something different. Because whether it's as a country or as people, and I'm sure you've experienced this at some level, once you decide that you're finished, you're done changing, every change in your life, every new piece of data is a threat. Because you can only take so much more new life before you break if you're unwilling to grow. Paradoxically, it is precisely the moments when we need to be most creative that we rely on our most ancient forms of wisdom and tool making. When the world is experiencing trauma and tragedy, when someone you thought would never die dies or leaves you, or you walked out the door. On the day when your job is over and you didn't expect it to be, or the election didn't go the way you thought, and their lizard brain is firing so strongly, at the very time when we have to make sense of the world and be creative, often we go back to the tools that used to serve us very well, maybe thousands of years ago or a lifetime ago. It's kind of like when someone that you love and live with is really growing and changing for the better, but your response is, "You're not the person I married." That kind of feeling. In the Bible, the teacher Jesus talks about it in the metaphor of putting new wine into old wineskins, for those of you who remember that passage. He says, you don't take new wine and put it into old wineskins, because if you do, they'll break, and you'll lose all your wine. He's concerned with wine. It's alive. It's a living thing. And if you put it into something that won't stretch, it'll break. The teacher Jesus equates liberation and freedom with being unfinished. You want a new life? Be a new person. You want more love? Be a new person. You want forgiveness? Be a new person. Don't put new life into the same old package. Which is a lot easier said than done, because if you're like me, you don't like change. Not even good change. It's hard to grow as a person, and I rarely want to unless the environment I'm in stops making sense. Because it takes a heck of a lot of loss that I think we don't acknowledge. In her book, Jennifer Garvey Berger talks about the fact that when kids develop a new skill set, they literally have to give up their capacity to experience the world the same. So, for example, a baby goes from being held to crawling to walking, and we cheer from the sidelines and celebrate with them their independence, and yet for them the entire world has changed. Life used to mean being held all the time, and to walk, it no longer means that. When a child learns to speak and use or understand words, we celebrate and clap from the sidelines, and yet, she says, they never get back what it meant to live before language, to live in that mystical, non-dual space before you had to make sense using words, that most of us here don't get back either, except for the true mystics in the room. It always involves some sort of loss. If you want to make sense of the world in a new way, you have to literally give up the way that you currently make sense of the world, and that can be a sting. We were talking the other day at a group of ministers about that, and I said to them that although coming out of the Methodist and then Baptist church, I gave up a lot of notions of God that felt like growth to me, and I'm not saying anything bad about Methodist or Baptist, this is just for me. I gave up a lot of notions of God that didn't feel real to me anymore, but even after I grew, I don't get that God back. That same God that, looking back, feels a little simple to me, loved me a lot. I got a new outlook, but I don't get that God anymore. at least not the same one. I think this is what the mystics and poets talk about when they say that you have to lose your life in order to gain it. Or when the Buddha says that non-attachment is the tool to use if you want to be enlightened. Every morning at 5 o'clock, and I mean every morning, I sit down and read the St. Francis prayer. And in it, it has all this paradoxical stuff about needing to forgive in order to be forgiven and dying to achieve eternal life. And you could interpret that as some sort of morbid, superstitious thing. Or you could say that if there's always something to learn and always a new person to be and always one more person to love and be forgiven by, then you can't have the same life you have today if you want that one. A little dying over and over and over again. So if we're going to do this growth business, which I assume a goodly percentage of us are interested in the room, if we're going to do this, it means that we have to learn to like living at the very edge of what we're capable of understanding all the time. Because by definition, the love you're not capable of having right now is just on the other side of who you are. It's like the poem by Carrie Newcomer that Beth read where she talks about revolution being a continual act where you let something go by the roadside day by day by day. And I wonder what it is for you. If you were going to grow deeper meaning in the world, if you were going to be loved by more people, if you were going to forgive and be wiser, what do you have to let go of at the side of the road? Ego? The idea that you are only your relationship to whoever you are married to or not married to? Maybe it's the idea that you are your political party or your church, which you're not. You're members of those things. I wonder what old self in you would have to go. Because like she said, it tends to only happen when we feel pressed. When the person that you're becoming doesn't make sense in the world around you, when you feel like, I have outgrown this role in this job. Or I'm not the person that the person I married. Or my country doesn't make sense. In her book, Jennifer Garvey Berger talks about practicing that possibility, and she says that if we want to be ready for the next phase of our development, we have to always ask ourselves a question that's just beyond our current capacity. For example, if you're really excited that you just joined the Unitarian Church, give yourself a couple of months and then start asking, what if that's not who I am? What if that is not all that would define me? If you've just gotten a new paycheck at work and you're really excited about your success, ask yourself, is that what success looks like? She suggests that we always ask the questions that are just beyond our current way of seeing the world. Again, easier said than done. For me, in order to live, I have to believe that things don't have to be this way. As a country and as a person. And I imagine that you too wish more was possible with your life. Sometimes it's hard to believe it unless we look backwards and get perspective. It's easier to give ourselves perspective as a country than it is people. But what happens if you look back on your past life and give yourself a little grace? The Quaker author Parker Palmer and Carrie Newcomer, who wrote the poem today, have a blog, and on it, every month they ask a question. Last month's question was, what in you is currently flowering that you never could have thought was possible before? What in you is flowering that you never would have believed was possible? And to look back and give thanks for that growth. They use the line from the poet Mark Nepo when he writes, "The simple rose in each moment of its slow blossoming is as open as it can be." The simple rose in each moment of its slow blossoming is as open as it can be. And so are you. What would it look like to go back and write a letter to yourself 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, or last year? How have you grown in ways that you never thought you were capable of? I can imagine writing a letter back to myself just a year ago and saying, I am so proud of you. Look at the ways that you've grown that you didn't ask to have grown in, but which happened nonetheless. I wonder how much faith you would have in yourself if you would look back at that self 5 years ago and say, I am so proud of you. You've experienced pain you didn't ask for, but you made meaning and you are still alive. You've grown in ways you could have never imagined, and you love people you didn't even know. I'm so proud of you. A little grace goes a long way. And so, like that teacher 2,000 years ago, or those today, there's something linked between you being unfinished and you being free. And you are unfinished. That can be a terrifying thing, because not only does it mean that you can grow up if you want to, it means you probably should. And change is not only one direction. And countries can get better, and countries can get worse. And lives can grow and broaden, or they can narrow in fear. But I have faith in us. Not just as a country, but as people. And I have faith in you. Not superstitious or naive faith, but faith in things not yet seen. Because whether or not you have one day left on earth, or 1 year, or 50 years, there is a version of you that hasn't yet shown itself to the world. And when it does, God's possibility will be manifest for us all. Let's have faith in one another. May it be so, and amen.